This video is going to be controversial, but before I get into the divisive parts, I want you guys to understand that I love Resident Evil 4 just as much as everyone else. This game was the first Resident Evil game that I played back in 2007, and it got me introduced to the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil 4 has always been my personal favorite out of the series, and I have a lot of memories attached to this complete masterpiece of a game. But I believe the fact of the matter is that we didn't need a Resident Evil 4 remake. Now I know there isn't anything I can do to stop Capcom, and at this point we're going to get it anyway, but nonetheless let's talk about what Capcom should have done rather than jumping straight to the cash cow of the franchise. The Resident Evil games, much like the Silent Hill games, are goated for the games ranging from 1 to 4. But when we look at Resident Evil 3 and 4, there was a massive jump between the games. Resident Evil 3 was a PlayStation 1 game, and Resident Evil 4 was released on the PlayStation 2. On top of this, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 were all released within a 3-year time frame, whereas Resident Evil 4 came out nearly 5.5 years after Resident Evil 3. This difference in time allowed for Resident Evil 4 to make leaps and bounds of improvements like implementing the over-the-shoulder camera and improving virtually every game system. This also makes Resident Evil 4 a lot more modern when compared to Resident Evil 3. If I have to make a comparison, my brain immediately jumps to another franchise I love, the Elder Scrolls games. The gap between Morrowind and Oblivion in terms of their game systems is comparable to Resident Evil 3 and 4, except I would say the gap between Resident Evil 4 and 3 is even bigger than the gap between Oblivion and Morrowind. In other words, Resident Evil 4 improved on its predecessor a lot, and this was in large part due to the improvements on the next-gen consoles back then. The difference between the PlayStation 3 and 4, or even the 4 and 5, is not even close to the jump from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2. The reason why I'm saying all of this is because the same need that we had for the remakes of the early Resident Evils, like 2 or 3, doesn't apply to Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 2 and 3 were very similar in terms of their game systems, graphics, and gameplay. These games are amazing, but they were desperately in need of a remake, and I'm so happy that Capcom had the common sense to do this unlike someone else. But when it comes to Resident Evil 4, I'm not going to say the game isn't completely outdated or in need of some touch-ups, but the game compared to the other entries is much more playable. I really do believe that Capcom should have taken their time with this one, and they should have remade other titles within the franchise that needed much more. For example, I think all of us would like to see a fully fledged remake of Resident Evil Code Veronica or Zero. These games were very solid. I personally think Code Veronica is a lot better than Zero, but I still think Zero has its place. With Resident Evil 0, you really just have to get past the train sequence and then the game really opens up. I feel like they could even update or change some of the storylines so that way it fits in better with the rest of the Resident Evil games. The other game that I personally think drastically needs an update is the original Resident Evil. The Resident Evil remake is amazing and easily one of the best remakes in all of gaming, but it has been so much time since the release of the remake that I think it's perfectly fine to update the game and give us a newer iteration. Especially since the people who play the newer Resident Evil games like 2, 3, 7, and Village probably don't want to go back and play the older games. I think the original Resident Evil should have been the highest priority target, since despite already having a great remake, it could still use an update for the modern generation. And I mean, let's look at it from a new fan's perspective. If someone has a PS5 and wants to get into Resident Evil, his options are Resident Evil 2, 3, 7, and Village. The logical thing that is missing is 1. And assuming for the sake of this example, this person wants to stick to his PS5, he won't be able to play Resident Evil 1 ever. I think if you're going through and remastering most Resident Evils like 2, 3, and now 4, you should also make sure that you consider the new fans who might just be getting into Resident Evil. For these new fans, you should have the starting point in one of the most important games in the franchise remastered too. But at the same time though guys, I get it. It's been 17 years since Resident Evil 4, and it'll be 18 by the time the Resident Evil 4 remake releases. It's easier to just go through the game sequentially, and when it comes to sales, a Resident Evil 4 remake will sell guaranteed, whereas a Code Veronica remake would probably not make as much money. It might sound like I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I honestly don't even know which side of the fence I'm on. Also, a Resident Evil 4 remake is a lot more fresh than a Resident Evil 1 remake, or a Code Veronica remake, since we have gotten games that are similar to those in recent years. For example, we got Resident Evil 7, which plays out similarly to Resident Evil 1 in terms of the setting and even some of the gameplay. But if you're making that argument, and at the same time you could say that Resident Evil Village is similar to Resident Evil 4, and therefore a Resident Evil 4 remake isn't that fresh either. When it comes to Code Veronica, it would be pretty unique if it were remade today, but Capcom doesn't want to take the risk since it's not a guaranteed sell like Resident Evil 4. Guys, I'm saying this stuff because the arguments go back and forth, and you have valid arguments for both sides. When I try to get my friends to play Resident Evil 4, even though the game is a masterpiece, some of them find it outdated and monotonous. They don't like the fact that the same models are repeated for some of the enemies, and they don't like the fact that the game is so focused on shooting, especially when your character can't even move while you shoot. The puzzle sections feel weak to them, and they don't seem to have the same appreciation for the game that we all did. And this is by no means meant to say that they completely hate the game, because most of them can still appreciate the level design and how unique Resident Evil 4 was for its time. It's just that level of appreciation that we had, being people who played the game around the release or back when it was still up to date, is not there. And it's not their fault that they can't play the game and appreciate it as much as we can, because they're playing the first over-the-person shooter after they've already gotten used to the genre, and they've probably already played other zombie games like The Last of Us that are much more modern than Resident Evil 4. So this takes out the revolutionary side of Resident Evil 4 and how it was a pioneer in the genre, because if someone experiences the first of something after they've already experienced some of the newer iterations, that first thing won't be as impressive. For example, if someone today went and saw the first computer or even an early Macintosh, it wouldn't be as impressive to them because they're used to MacBooks and modern PCs. My point in saying all of this is that I can see the argument for both sides, and honestly I am torn between what I think is right for the franchise. I think a Resident Evil 4 remake will sell monstrously well, whereas other possible remakes will likely not reach those same numbers. But what I want to conclude with is the fact that what I've been saying really doesn't matter. They've already decided. We're gonna get a Resident Evil 4 remake whether we want it or not. Let's just hope they do the game justice. Guys, that's all I have for this video. These videos take a lot of time and effort, so the support you guys provide really means a lot to me. Please consider checking out some of my other videos. I try my best to make original content over topics that don't get talked about, and if you made it this far, thank you, I love you, and I genuinely hope that you have a great rest of your day.